Hello, welcome to Making with Mark. I'm Mark, and today we're going to be looking at making the most out of some monopose kits, kitbashing them together with a multi-part kit in order to get more variety out of the poses. I wanted to do this because I had two sets of monopose orruks for my Kruleboyz army. One set had already been built, and it looks great, but I didn't want the second set to be built and have identical poses to the first ones. Since I was likely going to want more orcs for the army anyway, I thought I might as well pick up one of the multi-part kits and see if I can kitbash it together with the second monopose kit to try and get more variety out of the poses. Sometimes kitbashing is a very free-form process, laying out different bits and seeing what works. In this case though, I had a very specific end goal in mind, so I started by planning out exactly what I needed to make. By the end of this, I wanted to have 30 orcs split into 3 units of 10. That meant I would need 3 champions, 3 standard bearers, 3 musicians, and 21 regular boys. I've already got 1 champion and 9 boys from the previous set, so while kitbashing I needed to make 2 champions, 3 standard bearers, 3 musicians, and 12 regular boys. The champions and specialised models were probably going to be the most challenging to do well, so I did them first. This meant I could have the full range of bits and poses to choose from, as none would have been used up making the regular infantry. I began by clipping off the bodies and pieces that I was certain to be using for them, trying to pick poses that I thought would be easiest to modify into what I needed. For the banner bearers, this meant looking for poses that held their spears or right arms out in a more upright position than the others, so they'd be easy to reposition to hold a banner. Where possible, I used the monopose orruks as the base for the extra standard bearers and musicians. This meant the bulk of the regular boys would come from the multi-part kit, meaning fewer would need to be kitbashed to avoid repeating poses that I'd already built before. The multi-part kit came with 1 banner pole, 2 banner tops, and 2 instruments, useful but not enough for our plans. Fortunately, I had a spare hobgrot trumpet and banner topper in my Kruleboyz bits box, while banner poles were easy enough to make later from cocktail sticks. The hobgrot sprue is actually pretty good for extras, at least for a monopose kit. It sometimes feels like modern GW kits don't include as many spare bits and extras as they used to, but maybe that's just me being nostalgic. We're also going to be replacing the shields that the Kruleboyz normally come with. This army is inspired by a mix of Dragon Age and Lord of the Rings, so the shields are switched to be either made of wooden planks or hammered metal to better fit that aesthetic. Some of the monopose orruks have their shields sculpted onto their torsos, which made them a lot harder to replace. For these ones, I mostly went with the easier to make hammered metal look. To make sure there was still variety, most of the shields that weren't part of the torsos were chosen to be the ones I cut off and replaced with wooden versions. While kitbashing these, I typically assembled the main body but kept the head and arms off at first if possible. This gave me a base to start with when trying to adjust and change them into a variety of different poses that still felt natural. For this drummer orc, I filed a channel around its neck and back for the ropes of the drum to fit into. We'll use a bit of greenstuff later to fill any gaps that are left. Now we've got the specialists sorted, we can start on the regular boys. I used a Proxon micromot to grind down the sculpted details on the surface of some shields, not worrying about them being a bit rough as we're going to be sculpting over them with greenstuff later anyway. I then began to clip them off the sprues and assemble them. I continued modifying the shields as I went, as well as swapping out some of the heads and spear arms with spares from the multi-part kit. To make the standard bearers, I cut off the top of their spears, but left the lower part in place. A pin vice drill was used to hollow out their fists, but before I slotted in the cocktail stick banner pole, I had to reposition the arms. This was to make it easier to get to the elbow for cutting, and to prevent me accidentally breaking a cocktail stick I just glued in place. The sticks themselves were notched and cut with a sharp knife, to make them match the gnarled wood appearance of the spear shafts still in place. Small crossbeams were made in the same way as the banner poles, and attached with dabs of superglue. The banner toppers were then glued above these. We'll be making the banners themselves later, but for now we're going to get all of the plastic and epoxy work out of the way. Greenstuff epoxy, also called Needetite, was used to fill in gaps and cover where I'd swapped some parts around. The monopose minis often had neck or shoulder details included as part of the head component, so swapping the head meant needing to sculpt some of these details back in. I also replaced the textures on the metal shields. This was done by simply adding a ball of epoxy to the surface of the shield, smoothing it out, then using the back of a paintbrush to add dimples. The idea is to make the shield look like it's been made by crudely hammering a chunk of metal into a rough shape, with none of the care that you'd normally expect from an expert blacksmith. The models were then primed with a grey spray paint. This was done now before I've made any of the wooden shields, as we'll be painting them in a slightly different way to the rest of the models later. To make the wooden shields, I started out by trimming the ends off some coffee stirrers, then splitting them down the middle. This not only makes the widths of the planks feel more appropriate to the scale of the minis, but it gives them a rougher cut look, which is exactly what we're after for these orruks. These split coffee stirrers were then cut down into a mix of shorter lengths, and glued on using superglue. To paint the orcs, I'll always start with the eyes, using Citadel's Aerial Yellow in this case. Painting the eyes first doesn't seem to be a common preference, but it works for me personally because the eyes are the part of the model that I'm most likely to make mistakes with. By painting the eyes first, any mistakes I make can be easily corrected, without ruining the paint job of the rest of the face around them. Of course, you can paint your own models in whatever order you like. You might also have noticed at this point that I've raised each of the minis slightly above their base, either using the attachment peg or a small piece of styrene. This is so that when I add a layer of basing texture later, there's room for that layer to be applied without looking like the mini has sunken into it. Once I painted the eyes, I then moved on to the next recessed detail, again to reduce the need for cleanup later. Corn red is used for the interior of the mouths, while morghast bone is used to pick out the teeth. Next we'll use Rakarth flesh as the base for the skin tones. I've chosen not to thin the paint any further for this one, since this particular paint isn't the best at coverage, and these are only basic infantry models that are going to be part of a larger horde on the tabletop. Essentially, I'm trying to balance quality with actually getting the models finished in a decent time. For the clothes, we're going to use 3 different colours and paint them in a kind of patchwork pattern. I deliberately paint some of the adjacent patches in the same hue though, to avoid the different colours looking too evenly and systematically arranged. These aren't clothes made by fine tailors, these are things cobbled together by orcs using whatever scraps of cloth they can find. A rich brown, in this case rhinox hide, is used along with storm vermin fur, a kind of muddy grey colour. The last patches are painted with the very dark grey, Corvus black. Rope and thread details are picked out next with a few coats of Karak stone. Once these are done, the wooden details of the plastic kits are next. We're still leaving the shields unpainted at this point, but everything else that's wooden gets a coat of a desaturated brown, in this case Steel Legion drab. The metal details, being the most raised above the surface of the model, are the last to be painted. In this case I use Citadel's Iron Warriors, because it's what I'd used when I started the army. But if I were doing the paint scheme from scratch today, I'd probably pick something like Vallejo's Dark Aluminium or Gunmetal Grey, as I found their metallic paints to look a bit nicer than Citadel's ones. At least in my opinion. Extra details like earrings and instrument decoration were picked out in a brass hue. Now we've got all of the base colours applied, we're moving on to the washes. Reikland Flesh Shade is going all over the exposed skin sections, being particularly careful around the eyes. If you do happen to get some wash into areas where you don't want it though, it's not a problem. Just quickly use a clean brush with a little water on it to rinse out the area and soak up the excess wash. Make sure to let the area fully dry before you try to apply the wash again though, or the water will draw it back into the area that you just removed it from. Next we're going to paint a dark brown wash over all the cloth and metal areas of the model. If it's equipped with a wooden shield, then we're going to soak it in a black wash to age it and bring out the texture of the wood grain. With our washes applied, it's time for a dry brush of a pale skin tone, in this case pallid witch flesh. You want to try and keep this on the skin areas where you can, but if a little does get on the cloth here and there, then it can act as some light edge highlighting. Lastly for the skin, we're going to apply a little thin Carroburg crimson to certain details, namely the lower lips, nose, elbows, hands, knees and feet. This helps suggest blood flow under the skin, and gives it that last little something to make it look more like the body of a living creature, and not something like pale stone. For painted wooden details like the spears and banner poles, a quick dry brush of Baneblade Brown completes the unvarnished wood appearance. Kruleboyz models have a number of grisly trophies adorning them. To paint the death's heads, we're going to start by picking out the mouths and eyes with corn red, and the teeth with morghast bone. Then we're going to make a 1-to-1 mix of flaybon flesh and storm vermin fur, and apply this in thin layers over the dead skin. Next, a thin black wash is applied over the whole head. I then made a 2-to-1 mix of flayed-bond flesh and storm vermin fur and layered it onto the raised areas, drawing my brush towards the top of the piece so that more paint was deposited there than on the lower sections. This was done in a couple of coats to build up the opacity. Finally, Carrotbird Crimson is applied to the lower areas, where any blood still inside the head would pool without a pulse to keep it flowing. The last steps before varnishing are to add some basing paste and make the banners. I used to use Citadel's texture paints for basing, and they do the job fine, but for this army I've since found I much prefer using Amomig's acrylic mud. A metal sculpting tool is used to scoop up some of the paste and apply it to the base of the model. The same tool is then used to push the paste around, and make sure it's fully covering the base in all of its recesses. You've got quite a long working time with this, so you can take your time and get it looking just how you want. Once it's cured, we're going to dry brush the mud on the lower parts of the mini with Steel Legion drab, to show where earth has been kicked up and dried. The banners are pretty simple to make. I cut out some shapes of the banners from tissue, then tore the edges a little to roughen them up. A little PVA glue was used to attach them to a coffee stirrer, and then they were hung over a container while I thinned the rest of the PVA glue with some water. I used a cheap pipette from a craft store to gently soak the banners first with water, then with the watered down PVA. Soaking them with water first helps draw the PVA into all of the fibres of the tissues, making sure no parts get missed. Excess PVA that pooled at the bottom of the banners was removed using the pipette. This is partly to prevent it from forming a thick layer of PVA at the bottom of the banner, but also to stop it from weighing the banner down too much. Now, as the banner dried, it naturally started to bend slightly and looked like it was being blown in the wind. Once they'd dried, the banners were removed from the coffee stirrer and glued to the banner bearers with superglue. They were then painted black, and some freehand spear designs were painted onto them. I like the idea of painting the unit's weapon onto the standard, partly because I feel it fits the Orky mindset, but also because I like to imagine it being useful for identifying the units across the battlefield. The boss can easily tell what unit is equipped to deal with what, just by looking for their banner. Finally, the models are sprayed with a coat of matte varnish, and some grass tufts from gamer grass were added sparingly across the bases. I'm really happy with how these minis came out. They're a nice blend of being relatively quick to paint, at least for me, while still looking pretty good if you pick them up and look at them quite closely. A spare hobgrot sprue came in surprisingly handy for this project. It had a lot of spare bits like banner toppers and instruments that were really useful for these kit bashes. It surprised me given that the hobgrot sprue itself is a monopose kit. It certainly feels like a lot of modern GW kits don't have quite as many spare bits for kit bashing as they used to, but maybe that's just me being nostalgic. I hope you enjoy this video though, and let me know if you decide to try any of the things you've seen in it. Until next time though, I've been Mark, and I hope you have a wonderful day.